All right, welcome everybody to the first in our winter quarter series in the Program on the Environment at the University of Washington. This is the Conversations in Environmental Communication series. I'm so happy to have you all joining us here today. My name is Sean McDonald and I am the host for our seminars this winter quarter. I want to just say thank you to those of you who are joining us in the Zoom. I also want to say thank you to those of you who are joining us on YouTube as well. We've got a great speaker lined up today, and I'm just so happy that Priya Shukla was available to come and speak with us on a variety of topics and her work as well. I want to go ahead and begin, as we like to always begin, with our land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home, wherever you're joining us from today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. And so thank you, and I hope you all have a second just to think about the land you're joining us from today. As I said, I'm very excited to be introducing our guest. Our guest is Priya Shukla. She'll be sharing her experience communicating about science, the environment, and climate change across a variety of platforms and media. Priya is a PhD candidate in ecology at UC Davis. Her research explores the effects of climate change on shellfish aquaculture in California. She's working with Hog Island Oyster Companies to explore whether stress hardening the commercially farmed Pacific oyster through what's called heat shock reduces the species' susceptibility to disease outbreaks. Priya is an active science communicator and deeply invested in improving the accessibility of marine science. She's participated in many JEDI, or Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion endeavors, and has written about its integration in science in many venues, including her online ocean and climate science column with Forbes. Prior to beginning her PhD, Priya received her master's in ecology from San Diego State University and her bachelor's from UC Davis in environmental science and management. She's also worked as an environmental consultant, a high school teacher, a policy specialist, a public educator, and a lab manager. And I have to say, I have known Priya sort of broadly and generally for a long time through social media and also from seeing some of her amazing presentations at conferences as well. And so I think we're in for a treat. She's a passionate speaker, great speaker, and a great communicator. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, Priya. Let's go ahead and give her a round of applause, digital or real, and then I will turn the floor over to her. Priya, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hopefully you can see my slides, and if not, I trust that you'll let me know, but it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And thank you again, Sean, for giving me this opportunity. I have basically forged my own way into science communication. And so it's always a pleasure to share how I got to where I am. And I encourage you to certainly interrupt me and ask questions or hold them till the end. But here we go on my journey to science communication, and specifically environmental science communication is what I do broadly, because I do both climate change science and marine science. So that's where I'll be drawing from today, but I'm happy to provide reflections on how some of the principles I share might apply in other environmental science venues. So first, I want to start off by sharing with you where I'm coming from. So as Sean mentioned, I'm at UC Davis, but actually right now I'm talking to you from my home in Oakland, which is about 800 miles south of where UW is anyway. I'm not sure where all of you are at, given that so many of us are remote this week. And in being in this area, I also will briefly share my own territorial acknowledgement, which is that first and foremost, I live on Ohlone land, and my research is primarily done on Coast Miwok land. And Davis itself is situated on Patwin land. And what's important in acknowledging not only the people whose territories we tread upon, is also that they should have say in how these lands are stewarded. So a big part of this movement is a land back initiative, which is about giving indigenous people a say in how the lands that are theirs are stewarded. It's not about us vacating, us settlers anyway. So from there, I'm going to talk about my own background, and I'll share briefly about what I do as a PhD student, although Sean did that pretty well on my behalf. And then I consider myself a science communicator, but really my primary medium is writing, and Sean knows that primarily through me writing many a sassy tweet. So I can also talk about Twitter as a science communication medium, although I won't necessarily be doing much of that today. But what you're looking at right now is Tamales Bay, which is where I do a lot of my work. And right at the bottom of the screen, you'll see these little grids, it looks like, little squares. They're actually oyster baskets. Maybe folks up in UW doing marine science work know these better than a lot of the folks that I generally give this talk to. But this is one of the leases that Hog Island Oyster Company operates. And I am very lucky to be able to not only visit this lease, but to get there, go through some protected land that maybe only 20 to 30 people get to access a year. So I just wanted to share this beautiful foggy paradise that is what I call my research site. Now, to move on, I'm going to be talking about science communication. Like I said, I'm a writer, so maybe what I'll be slipping in inadvertently is the way I've written about things and how I go about doing that. But my goal really is to share the mediums through which I communicate and why I think they're particularly effective. But before I get into that, let me talk about what science communication even is. So it's more than just this idea of communicating science, which plenty of scientists do. It's also about figuring out how people actually engage with science and what they take away. It's about making sure that the science that you deliver and put out in the world is put to use in a way that is beneficial to the society that you're a part of. And it's also about creating stories that will be engaging in indirect ways. And when I say indirect, I mean things like a digital venue where you're not interacting with the science personally in any specific way. And so how do you do that when you're at a computer yourself, and then you know that the recipient of the science is also going to be sitting at a computer far, far away and might be somebody you've never met or even know exists. And and at the bottom of that, before I push on, were just a couple of hashtags, which are SciComm. And so you'll hear me also use science communication and SciComm interchangeably. But I'm going to talk a little bit about traditional versus modern approaches to SciComm. That's one of those hashtags. Pursuing SciComm as an early career scientist, which is what I am and what I do. And it's considered a little bit risky, although it's also the heart of a lot of what I do, I think. Examples of SciComm projects, I'll be focusing primarily on my own, and then I'll be giving examples of a couple of others who've been doing some of this work. And then some opportunities to get involved yourself if you think that this is something that interests you. And that will include a few tips. So I want to start with this quote from Rush Holt, who is the CEO of AAAS. And he says that for science to work, communication is essential. And so a lot of that is baked into what scientists already do, and I'll touch on that in a second. But I think the best way to get into it is by talking about how we used to think about communicating science and how we do it now, at least as people who are engaged in this idea of practicing science communication. So something that you'll hear communicators themselves say, or people who support science communication, is that scientists are bad communicators and they need proxies. They need somebody else to sell that science. And so examples of this not being true are Carl Sagan, who was a scientist and he basically stewarded this very deeply influential program on PBS called Cosmos. There's Bill Nye, who's not technically a scientist, he's an engineer, and there's a different 15-minute talk I could give on why I have a beef with Bill Nye that I won't provide now. But Bill Nye certainly was deeply influential to me in my childhood, and I went back and watched Bill Nye the Science Guy on Netflix at the top of the pandemic. It still holds up. It's very good entertainment. Highly recommend revisiting it. And then, of course, there's Science Friday, and Ira Flato is one of those proxies who basically helps ferry what scientists are telling him into the minds of listeners and pulling out the most salient information. And he does a really good job, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you always need a proxy to be an effective communicator. So what science communication used to be was this deficit model. It was this idea that the public, general public, which doesn't really exist, but people who were not scientists were skeptical of science because they lacked evidence and information and understanding. And so all you needed to do was give them more information and they would be convinced of reality or the truth. And of course, living in this pandemic now for 2 years, it's pretty clear that you can give people as much information as possible, and they still will be rooted to whatever their belief system is, in spite of an overwhelming body of evidence. And so the reason that I think that this exists, this deficit model existed, is because generally a skeptical scientist can be convinced with more information, right? As scientists, we change our minds all the time. And that's not a bad thing. It's because there's more information out there for us to consume that tells us, oh no, this is actually our new truth. This is our new reality. And so what we've learned is that the best way to connect with people is through this engagement model. And it's this idea that science must be presented within the context of a person's lived experience and their beliefs and their values, and not just theirs, but also the community they belong to. And so somebody asked in the chat, aren't many people today, despite informed and understanding, they're still skeptical due to religious reasons? And yeah, I think religion is certainly part of those belief systems that can play a role in how people interpret information. I found, though, and I'll actually provide an example of somebody who does some of this work more than I do, that religion can be really nuanced, and people have different pockets of information that they cling onto that maybe might be contradicted by science. But that is something that I am certainly not an expert in how you communicate science to religious audiences. But I can tell you what I do know if you want to dig into it afterwards. So just to get back to this, and this question is very much related to what I was talking about, which is that you have to basically meet people where they're at. It doesn't matter where you're at. You have to bring the science to them in a way that caters to who they are. And so effective science communication is as much about the science as the people that you're trying to connect with. And this has not only been something that practitioners have been talking about, but there's peer-reviewed evidence for it. So there's a PNAS paper that suggests that using narratives and storytelling is actually a really effective way to share scientific information. And then, of course, there are popular science books like The Sixth Extinction by Betsy Colbert, who I think is one of my favorite. I know. She's one of my favorite science writers. There's Hidden Figures, which is more about the people who have been erased from scientific narratives than about the science itself. This, of course, highlights Black women who worked at NASA in the middle of the 20th century. And then there's Matt James, a professor at Sonoma State University, and he wrote a book called Collecting Evolution, which is about the California Academy of Science in San Francisco, and how it's actually basically a repository of a bunch of examples of evolution that are related to some of Darwin's own excursions. And that, as you can imagine, is not necessarily going to cater to folks in Washington, but that book did really well in the Bay Area because it was about a local institution. And so there are different ways to connect with the people who are out there and who maybe you want to connect with, and figuring out that medium is a challenge, but when you do it, it means that you can become a really effective communicator. So I'm going to say that I totally disagree. I think I've already said it, but that scientists are not bad communicators. And in fact, part of this is baked into what we do professionally. So scientists create eye-catching posters that hopefully our role models and heroes will stop by and ask us questions about. We create captivating seminars that we really think deeply about how to craft our messages so that, in our case, a technical audience will be able to take away the key messages we're trying to deliver. And of course, we write papers. And that's actually where I learned that I love to write, was that I had to write a publication and a thesis as a part of my master's. And that was my favorite part of my entire degree. And so I've fed that into other parts of my life now. And I find it to be very nourishing for me. There's also something that's important to point out, which is that scientists are also really, really diverse. So the 3 examples I gave you of communicators who are considered prolific are white men. And they by no means embody the experience of scientists as a collective. And I mean that both in the US and internationally. And so what that means is that when we're talking about scientists as communicators, we have to embrace that there are different modes and means and kinds of communication, that people will come from different perspectives. And that means that when you have been in a scientific society that is really created for and by white men, you will be unprepared for really creative ways of communicating science. And you have to be prepared to be flexible and be willing to experience science in that way. And one of the great ways that I found this to be true as I have grown up in science is that people younger than me are better communicators than I am. And part of that is because they're able to take care of digital platforms. They can basically find different platforms to communicate on that I didn't even realize were an option for science communication. And that also means that you increase the accessibility of science, because now you're reaching new audiences, you're finding new ways to engage. And that means that not only does the scientist have options, but their audience can also change. And I think I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But when I talk about accessibility in this case, I'm specifically talking about people with disabilities, in fact. And so that their social media in some ways, things like TikTok, where you have options for closed captioning, really do actually increase the accessibility of science in ways that other media do not. So now I'm going to talk about what it's been like for me pursuing science communication as an early career scientist. And I'm going to say right now, I'm going to give you the highlights of the things that I'm the most proud of, but it's been a pretty rocky road. And I think that's something that we can explore in the questions a little bit more. But I can promise you that being a loud brown woman who happens to love talking about science and not always my research can be challenging when I'm also pursuing a PhD. And so what I said right before is that basically, as I've watched younger scientists come in, that they're able to take advantage of new platforms. And that includes things like Snapchat, which I never really got into Snapchat because I would get excited about something that I shared and then not be able to find it again. But TikTok, I really appreciate. I downloaded it before my qualifying exam to blow off steam, and I never undownloaded it. I'm a huge fan, and I watched some really wonderful science communication happen on that platform, as well as some weird science beefs. So TikTok is a magical stew of wonderful weirdness. And something else that I think early career scientists can do when they're doing science communication is experiment with platforms that elder scientists appreciate and know of, but then sort of warp them to do something different. So this series called Conservation Stories from the Front Lines featured a series of well-known scientists telling data-driven stories, and there were actually figures in these publications, but the actual crafting of the words was not your traditional intro methods results discussion. It was a beautiful personal essay about their experience collecting those data and what their reflections are as a human being, and not just like what are the broader implications of their research. And I go back and revisit this when I need inspiration for doing my own communication, even like when I'm doing like more formal proposal writing or something. I also think that one of the really exciting things I've seen happen is that my colleagues have basically been tapped through media like Instagram and Twitter to then write op-eds basically in places like Nature and Science. And doing so basically props you up as an expert, not because you aren't already, but because you're now in this esteemed publication. Other people who are more senior to you will automatically be like, oh, yes, of course, you're an expert. Why else would have somebody from Nature or Science tapped you to talk about things like wildfires or abalone conservation? And Erin Winnick is somebody who just has a bachelor's I say this as somebody who's on their like 50th degree in academia, but she has a bachelor's degree and she decided like, no, I'm an expert in engineering. I'm going to make this a thing. And so her Medium page is really well followed. I think I took the screenshot a couple of years ago, but she has really blown up as somebody who is an early career scientist, but who's certainly an expert. And so you don't need to go on and get a master's or a PhD like me to establish yourself as a bona fide individual doing environmental science, or in the case of Erin, an engineer. And of course, science communication gives you a chance to diversify your skill set. I found as a PhD student, as I'm applying for different fellowships and things, that my science communication, which in some arenas can serve as a hindrance, really comes up as an asset, because they'll ask for proof that you're a good like communicator and you're good at collaborating. And when you're extending yourself beyond your comfort zone as a scientist, you have to do both of those things. You have to communicate clearly, and you're collaborating with people who are not necessarily in your sphere. And so you're forced to basically become much better at interpersonal skills, but also you build this really cool, diverse network of friends and colleagues as a result. But of course, there are risks. And again, this is going to be me touching on a couple of those rocky road things. One is that you expose yourself personally by putting yourself out there. Sean has certainly seen me get into a couple of beefs with people that at the time really stung, and now I'm glad I stood up for myself and stood by my values. But that's not everybody's cup of tea, and it can leave you emotionally raw, choosing to have those battles or to be in the line of fire. This binary is fading, which I'm excited to see, but there's still this idea that there's objectivity, which is that you're merely providing the people with the information they need. And there's advocacy, which is that you're taking a position. And when you're taking a position, some people argue that you're compromising your position as a scientist. I say that in this last decade that we have to actually make really like large strides on curbing catastrophic climate change, all you can do is advocate at this point. There is no, the objectivity is that the climate crisis is here. And so we have to advocate for our own survival. But that's just my opinion. There are still those who might say that that's not necessarily true, and that we should still be taking a step back as scientists. And then third of all, it's a time sink. There are certainly advisors who would not be thrilled with the amount of time I spend doing science communication. I'm lucky that mine does not feel that way, but that's why it's a good match. But certainly if this is not a skill you want to build, or it's just not how you want to spend your time period, then maybe it's not for you. So now I'm going to talk about examples of science communication projects. And again, most of these will be the ones that I participated in, but I'll also be sharing a couple others. So why I even decided to jump into this in a really overt way was because of the 2016 election, and because I really realized that I had been resting on my laurels. Like I was like, oh, change is happening and I don't need to be an active part of it. I decided that that just isn't the case anymore. By the way, you might have noticed a picture transition on this slide. Around 2017, I discovered an extension in Chrome called Make America Kittens Again. And I decided to extend it into this talk for my own sanity and my own self-preservation. But essentially what I realized was that that specific administration was actively taking a sledgehammer to the role that science plays in like not only in like civics, but also in society. And also it was really hammering home for me as a brown woman, and these things were all intersecting at the same time. And I was really disappointed to see that my colleagues who weren't necessarily grappling with the same issues weren't willing to address this intersection of issues. And so I was like, fine, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. And so that's what led me to a series of different activities that I get to participate in. So for example, my most recent hat that I wear is that I am a reporter for Currently, which is a weather service led by Twitter, and Eric Holthouse, who's a climate reporter. And basically it's a regional weather report. And I have, from Monday to Friday, provide just like a brief climate weather culture update to remind people that yes, climate change is happening. Yes, weather is, you need to know the weather, but also this is what we're fighting for. And this, like our community and our culture and who we are as a San Francisco Bay Area. This is what's happening. And all of this is connected and intersected together. I also really love talking about scientific narratives and how we need to diversify them. And particularly because there's been a lot of erasure historically of people of color and just marginalized people in general from science. And oftentimes we tend to focus on stories of oppression and not stories of celebration. And so in 2018, for a regional magazine called Bay Nature, I wrote an article called Calling for Revisionist Natural History, which is like, let's bring these people back into these narratives. All these people who we don't get to hear about. Like, I'm tired of John Muir. I don't need to hear about him anymore. Like, let's talk about the indigenous people. Let's talk about the Sikh farmers in Northern California who are growing all the almonds we eat. Let's talk about the Vietnamese fishermen. Like, that's who we should be talking about. And then, of course, I do it to increase science literacy and joy. And for myself, I find that writing specifically for Forbes, where I have an audience I wouldn't otherwise have, I am really getting to connect with people and share what I think is salient information when it comes to ocean and climate science. And so you can check out my writing at forbes.com/sites/Priya Shukla. And then, of course, to build public trust in science. And so this is a weird example, but last year, no, 2 years ago now, the pandemic for me is like one long year. But in May 2020, I got to write about, believe it or not, the 1918 flu. And it's because I'm part of this society that is predominantly social scientists, and they have a standing call, like a contribution series with the Bangor Daily News, and the Bangor Daily News is based in Bangor, Maine. So I was in Berkeley writing for a publication in Maine, but I initially rejected. I was like, I'm not the right person for this. I'm not in Maine, and I don't do like human disease. I do oyster disease. And they were like, it's you, or we go to somebody else who's not a scientist at all. So I decided to write this anyway. And it was like, my Forbes articles don't have comments for really obvious reasons because I study climate change. So that would just be a fiasco. But in this case, their comments were open, and I saw a really wide range of comments, everything from, yes, absolutely, we need to lock the country down, to no, the elderly need to die for the economy, which I was like, wow, this is a very, very widespread, like basically dialogue that's happening that I don't normally get to experience. And my favorite part of science communication is community engagement. I really love connecting with people. And again, the same way that I talk about, I talked about like the intersection of climate and culture in San Francisco, like the newsletter, the weather newsletter does that. But speaking to people in person is my favorite, and I miss it so much. And I think part of the reason for that is because that's how you get to sprinkle emotion and empathy into the science that you do. And so I was actually interviewed by Brooke Gladstone for On the Media in 2019 because I was in a piece about the grief that climate scientists carry. And I talked a lot about just how I both channel my grief into the science that I do, but also like why I carry my grief at all. Like why don't just dispose of it or ignore it? And it was just like this really like otherworldly opportunity to be sitting at NPR headquarters in Washington, DC, but two, to also get feedback from not just like people from all around the country, but my own family. Like my cousin who listens to NPR and On the Media religiously was surprised and like so enamored of me. And after that has like thrown himself fully into supporting anything that I do. And then of course there's like actual practical decisions. And I just saw Rebecca's comment, I'm so tired of John Muir too. Yes, Rebecca, let's start a club. And John, can you speak a little on the interplay between informational content and narrative form in communication? I'm going to meditate on that. I think that's a little bit tricky. That's a really good question. So I'm going to think on that one for a bit, John. But I'm just going to get back to my talk, which actually is about, this section actually considers the informational content component, which is that I think something that's unexpected that I didn't actually think I'd ever get an opportunity to do, but that I have been able to do with science communication is actually facilitate science-based decisions. So I went to an aquaculture conference the August before I started grad school, and I met this person who basically runs a sustainability seminar series, but with people on the ground. It's a very grassroots effort. And so he asked me to come give a talk about climate change and the role that agriculture plays. And I was just transitioning from working on ocean acidification into oyster aquaculture. And it was just like this really fabulous opportunity to connect all of those things. And my audience was like 80 farmers. I would never otherwise get to speak with somebody who's like a Missouri farmer, you know what I mean? And so it was amazing to be able to share with them one-on-one what I have learned as a scientist and help them answer their own questions. And then in 2019, the reason that I was even in DC for the interview was to actually work on a roundtable about aquaculture. And I got to write a legislative report about the state of aquaculture in the US that basically got passed around Congress and the White House. And that's pretty cool that somebody who has probably shook hands with Joe Biden read my legislative report. So I'm gonna take that as a win. And to sort of begin to wrap this up, I think one of the other reasons that I've done science communication is really like professionally selfish, but I don't regret that. And it's because basically by doing SciComm, I have extended my network. I even just like submitted a paper with 3 other people who I've only ever met through Twitter. Like we've never met in person, any of us. And we wrote about science communication. I have found collaborators, not only through just the project I described, but now one of the primary people on my committee is somebody who was really impressed with an article I wrote, and then I later interviewed her for a different article, and then all of a sudden she's like, I'm processing oysters in her lab. So it's like it has built on itself, and that was like 5 years in the making. Job hunting, I have no direct evidence yet, but talk to me in June 2023. But I've heard that science communication can help with finding a job. And then in my case, it's like appeasing funding agencies. Like I found that the people who fund my research very much do appreciate my ability to also very quickly and clearly articulate what I'm doing and why people should care. So why other people might be doing it that is not necessarily in my wheelhouse is first to educate other people about just science. It sort of goes back to the Carl Sagan approach. Ologies is like a fantastic podcast that I think does this education piece really well. You might want to inspire awe and wonder. Well, I know Neil deGrasse Tyson is kind of a controversial SciComm figure. I think Star Talk does a really good job of inspiring people. And Science Sam, if you're not familiar with her work, she does a great job engaging people when it comes to neuroscience. And she's now actually like used her like expertise to also talk about COVID. And then to build trust again between the scientific enterprise and the voting public. So somebody mentioned religion in the chat, and Catherine Hayhoe is a climate scientist whose primary audience in a lot of cases is actually like evangelical Christians, and talking about like why it's a responsibility of Christians to steward care of the earth. That's like the approach she takes. And then there's a Story Collider, which is a lot about humanizing scientists. So in Story Collider series, which is like an in-person series, but that also does a podcast, it's scientists telling stories about themselves. So the science they do is not always the point on which the story pivots. Oftentimes it's about like, oh, well, I immigrated from somewhere, or, oh, here's a huge failure I had that sort of played a part in the publication or something that I wrote later, but really it played a part in my growth as a person. And I think that that is a really important feature, is that reminding people that scientists are also people. And then this is the part that I'm probably the least successful at, but it's to express creativity. So Jill Pelto is this wonderful artist who takes climate data sets and converts them into artwork. So here you're seeing an ice core, tree rings, and lichens. That's what these data show. And I think it's warming they show. And then on the right is Two Photon Art, which is an art collective run by Christine Liu, who just graduated with her PhD from UC Berkeley, but she was also a neuroscience student, and her jewelry is beautiful. I'm actually wearing a pin of hers right now that maybe you can see. So finally, I'm gonna wrap up and actually talk about where you can go if you want to start doing this work. So the first is to look within your professional society. If you're an undergraduate student, your campus probably has a ton of opportunities to actually get involved. And what that means is you can meet with your legislators, you can write op-eds in your local paper, which congressmen, especially like from not the Senate, I can't remember the other side right now, House of Representatives. Sorry, it's the end of the day and I'm like in my own head. the House of Representatives, like those folks actually do read local papers from their districts. K through 12 education, if that's your speed. I'm terrible with children, so it's not mine. And then media engagement. If you really want to be the person who appears on CNN to talk about something, you can be. And professional societies and campuses actually have like a pathway and a channel to get you there if you want to be there. And then something I used to always suggest when I was like presenting at a science cafe, because talking to people in person is my favorite thing to do. Now I don't know what that looks like in every single place, but look for a science cafe locally and presenting virtually. And even if you're an undergrad student, you feel like you're not an expert, that is not true. You know so much more than you give yourself credit for. And you have the ability to totally pull together something really interesting on whatever you think matters. And you can also contribute to this pre-existing AGU blog series called The Plain Spoken Scientist. They take pitches from everybody and they love publishing. They're always looking for content. AGU is the American Geophysical Union, but I'm a biologist and they've let me like be a fake geologist or a geophysicist or geoscientist for a second so I can have my word or say my word, excuse me. So that's definitely an option. And the American Institute of Biological Sciences also does a lot of work in connecting scientists with like opportunities like this. And AAAS, this is more for graduate students who are looking for like their next step, but the American Association for the Advancement of Science, it's their CEO that I started our talk off with. They have a couple of opportunities, including a mass media fellowship, which would place you with a local newspaper for a summer, or actually, and you would do this as well, is that at the end of your PhD, it's only if you have a PhD, you can go into DC for 2 to 3 years and they'll stick you in an agency or an organization where you will work firsthand doing a lot of really cool, hard policy work. And that opportunity basically leads to people doing some really cool, funky things. There's like somebody now who used to study marsh plants and now helps, is like the assistant to a military strategist. So it can take you to amazing places. I promise I'm almost done. You can create you can curate, a ROCUR or rotating curation Twitter account that includes minorities in STEM and real scientists. And the woman who runs at Real Scientists has a really great sense of humor. So I think that would be really fun for you. And if you're interested in using Twitter, I also wrote a guide with my colleague Saba, who is also University of California alumnus. And you can check that out. And then I think the last thing I wanted to say was that you want to set tangible goals. And that means that I've thrown a lot at you right now, but if you want to actually do this well, you need to figure out what your goal is and then figure out how you're going to get there and what's feasible for you. So think carefully about what you would like to achieve and then identify the shortest path to get you there. And of course, know who you're talking to. Know that you really want to engage with people who are within your sphere and willing to actually listen to what you have to say. And this is like true, especially with climate change, but it's very rare that you can go to somebody who's very far removed from your system of belief and change their mind. And that can be really, really, really difficult. So with that, I spoke a little bit longer than I'd hoped to, but I really appreciate your time and your energy and your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, starting with John's, which I abandoned. Yeah, sorry, I'll pause there for a second.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate it. I think we all really appreciate it. But I know we have some questions for you. As you say, you already have John's. I see Riley has asked a question as well, and Jessica has her hand up. So I think we can just get right into it if you've had a drink of water and you're ready to get started.
Yes. Okay, so starting with John's question. So a little bit about the interplay between informational content and narrative form. So I think the narrative form is there to really juice people up, like to give them something to hook their fingers and their teeth and sink their teeth into. And you basically want to, and you see this with like newspaper articles, right? They have something called a lead, which is that they know people are not going to read the whole article. So to convince them that it even matters, you start your first sentence off with what is actually what you're saying? Why does that even matter? And then you sink into the details. And the details will be a combination of like why you're emotionally gripped by this, and then what the stats are and why the stats are emotionally gripping. And that's like this feedback loop that you use. And that's what I employ when I'm writing Forbes articles. And nowadays I try to actually end with like a human interest bit, which is like, how do you actually factor into this as my reader? Like, how do we as humans interface with the fact that because we brought sheep to the follicle islands and they're pooping everywhere, that's affecting native fauna? Like, right, like I try to really connect that very long thread together. So hopefully I'm addressing that question. But if not, John, I'm happy to keep chatting about it. Riley asked, from all of your experiences so far, it seems there are many job opportunities available in this field. Which of your past experiences, whether paid or volunteer, has been the most fulfilling to you? So one thing, you should always get paid. It's really hard to get paid doing science communication in the beginning. That's changing, but when you can, try to get paid. I already mentioned that I really like writing and I really like connecting with people. When I was in Washington, D.C., that was probably the most like energizing experience because I was meeting with people who I only had 10 minutes of their time. And so I had to like basically make a pitch in 10 minutes. And I was a really effective communicator. What I did a really bad job at is you're supposed to show up with like this one pager, which is like a summary of all the things that matter. And I made it like a third grader would have, because I wanted to be engaging and quick. So I was like, here are 4 block words, and you'll remember this. There's this beautiful photo of a kelp forest and some clams and oysters, because I thought that was what I wanted to hang on their like desk, and they'd be like stunned by the imagery. But I looked like a child by handing that over, because I saw it. I literally saw the person put it down on top of the piece of paper that the person before me had given them, and so they didn't care that I gave a pretty photo. But I think engaging with people in that tight window to convince them that they should reach out to you in the future if your expertise comes up was like really fantastic. And it totally like botched my self-esteem for a couple months there when I realized what a fool I'd been. But I really learned some good SciComm chops doing that stuff. There are more questions in the chat, but I also know that Ernesto, Lucy, and Jessica have had their hands raised.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll go to the live ones first.
Yeah, let's have some folks ask some questions. I think Jessica might have had her hand up first.
Great.
Thank you, Professor. Priya, I just want to say, like, just to start off, your work ethic, I'm completely shocked by it, just with everything that you presented. I don't know what to say other than like, you're a great role model for like environmental studies. But I guess one of the first questions I want to start off with is, obviously all of us are trying to find like our own name and our own image within like the environmental career. So what advice could you give to us as kind of starting off those first steps of how to stay connected with these connections that we're going to find eventually, and just how to keep that going as you have? Because it seems like with your past experience, like your success has come from cultivating and also taking care of these relationships and networks that you've spoken about.
So I really do care about people. And that's a great question, by the way, Lucy. I really do care about people. And I didn't figure out networking really until I was an academic, because part of being an academic is that you have to learn stuff. And even though people write their methods so that you can repeat them, that's not true. You need to go and find somebody who actually knows how to do what they did. And what I realized is that it is my job to care for these people, like as part of that. And it can be strategic, but basically the biggest thing I've done that I found to be most successful is like the people who I care about or whose work I find really interesting, I keep tabs on. And so when I see that somebody's paper came out, or I saw that they got a new job, or even that they moved or something, I'll be like, congratulations. And it's something really brief. It'll be 2 sentences. But really what that does, oh, thanks for on-screen sharing for me. What that does is that it continues to foster whatever that connection is. Even if it was just like a brief 20-minute phone call, like maintaining this, like, even if it's a facade, even if you don't actually care, but maintaining that connection that makes it look like you care is really important, especially now when everybody is so distant. Those things matter even more. Does that make sense? So like, and I found that professors really love hearing from their old students. I like messaged a professor who I saw tweet something. I was like, I don't think you remember me, but I was in your class and blah, 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 blah. And here's where I'm now. They're like, oh yeah, no, I know, I've heard about you. Thanks for letting me know, or something. So even stuff like that is great. And it takes like no time. after Lucy, I think it was Anne. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Jessica, I'm sorry. I'm like losing track of names.
Yeah.
This is like, my brain is like totally spaced.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry.
No, it's
Jessica,
okay.
Lucy,
I think,
and Anne.
do we have Lucy and then Anne, I believe, right?
Hi. So I was actually curious, like in your past experience as a public educator and like a high school teacher, and now in your current experience as a general science communicator, did you ever kind of develop a like habit of best practice in how you communicated like heavier scientific problems, like environmental issues to younger audiences, like kids or teenagers?
Yeah, so you'll recall that I said that I'm terrible with kids. That is part of the reason. I really struggle with, I have really high energy, so people think I'm gonna be great with kids, and that's like not true. Like that's not, it's a really unfair thing to put on me because then I like traumatize these children. But I will say, what I found that is really useful in connecting with young people when it comes to really big things is actually youth climate movement specifically. So there are so many youth movements across the board. And by being like, yes, you're right, this is really heavy. And I'm not your age. And so I actually don't think about the same way you do. But here's a group of people who do. And I found that like people younger than me are way more activated than I am, and they're way more aware than I am. And so like I suggested some, it's like youth indigenous movement. They're like, I'm familiar with them. I'm looking for something else. And I was like, I can't help you. I'm sorry. That is like the limit of my ability to help you. I'm very sorry. And so I think learning to talk to people from this, like from a generation that is a little bit behind you is a skill that I just don't have. So I'm sorry I can't be more helpful, but I think being able to direct them to people of their own age who do seem to be doing that work is the best tool that I personally have.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Great.
think
Then
maybe,
Anne, finally,
yeah.
getting the names.
and then maybe Ernesto after that.
Okay,
Sure.
perfect.
Yeah, okay, thank you for your lecture. Well, in this course, we're being introduced to Twitter. And you talked a bit about TikTok, which I found funny. If we want to engage and focus just on a few social media, which ones would you recommend us, and why those?
Yeah. So I'm really bad at TikTok. If you find me on TikTok, which good luck, because I don't use the same handle that I do elsewhere, you'll see just videos of my cat because I was experimenting with all of these like different things that TikTok can do. I found that a lot of other people though do really well at TikTok, and they've really taken to it and they really get it. And there's just like so much of culture is happening there. So I know people in their 40s and 50s more on TikTok. So I think like it's something that you can, like it's spanning generations is what I'm trying to say. It seems like a youth like social media platform, but you can find a really wide audience. The algorithm is a mystery though. So how you even end up in somebody else's phone screen, I have no idea. Twitter is a really bad way to science communicate. You build really good connections and you commiserate with people, but I think it is the most bubble building outside of Facebook. I think a lot of the best sitecom I've seen is on Instagram, because people basically post like a captivating photo and sometimes or like a great figure or a great series of pictures that overall tells you a story that they can then put in their stories, if you know what I mean. The stories function within Instagram, or they can also add a narrative in the caption. So if you were to start somewhere, I would say Instagram is the easiest thing to get a foothold into and just to practice with, you know. And then there are people within your circle of influence who'll be experiencing that, and so you'll be connecting with people in your circle. So that's where I would start. But I think TikTok has a lot of different features and memes that you can take advantage of and manipulate towards your own communication experiences. But if you want to build a network, I think Twitter, and Sean is very much part of my Twitter network, Twitter is where you get the networking and where you can meet your kinfolk.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just point out TikTok. You can check out Icy Pete on TikTok. He's a faculty member from the Midwest who actually does ice science down in Antarctica, and he does some really great TikToks on that. We'll talk more about that in class. Ernesto, I think maybe you're next, and then Zena.
Yeah, sure. Hello. So I had a question about like when we're engaging with people on Twitter or whatever. What are some of the pitfalls like we should avoid? Like what did you wish you did differently when you started out, or maybe like what mistakes did you make? I'm just kind of interested in knowing that.
Yeah. I think I'm still making a lot of mistakes on TikTok, not TikTok. I'm making tons of mistakes on TikTok, but being on TikTok is a mistake. So it's a bunch of mistakes. Twitter. I think Twitter is like a very confusing platform that I've been on for a decade now, and I still don't fully understand. I think the biggest mistake I've made is that if you were to read through all my tweets, I come across as a very sad, angry person. And I have not been able to change that perception of sad, angry cat lady. That's it. And I haven't really been able to change that perception of myself. Like people meet me and they're like, I'm so surprised, you're so bubbly. You seem so morose on Twitter. So I would suggest maybe interspersing your real, honest, deep soul feelings with just like bits of joy, I guess. Also, don't be afraid to connect with people. Like I think one of the things I didn't do was I'd follow people but then never engage with them. And I think just being like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to meet you. I've seen your work before, you're great. And they'll be like, oh my gosh, thank you. And you probably made their day by saying something like that, like in their DMs. So like bring different facets. If you're like using Twitter as a networking tool, bring facets of your personality to it. And then also don't be afraid to like cold message people and tell them why you think they're awesome. And they'll probably think you're awesome too. And that's how you begin to like build your network. Also, don't be afraid to make jokes. I don't joke enough on Twitter. Make all the jokes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, and follow Jorts the cat on Twitter. That has been like the limelight of 2021 and 2022 for me so far. So yeah. Okay.
Jorts the cat. Yes.
Zena, and then I'll go back to the chat after that.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question was, since you have such a wide range of experience, starting from like high school teacher to policymaking, policy specialist, I was wondering, like, what did you do or how did you build such diverse skill set to be able to do all of those?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of those things I did fresh after undergrad, so they were skill building experiences in and of themselves. I taught high school at my old high school, so I knew the people. That's how I got my leg in there. And it's how I quickly learned that I don't have the stamina to teach high school. Like I am a terrible high school teacher. Also, when you're shorter than all of the students in the class, they do not take you seriously. And I'm 5 feet nothing. So like, it was a really tough sell that I was an authority figure. And my brother was a student there at the time. So they were just going shit talk me to him. I'm sorry, but they were going shit talk me to him, which was so not cool. So that was part of the reason that I realized that it's not a good fit for me. But I basically like convinced my old teachers that I would be a good fit to teach there, and they agreed. So I was like a guest teacher for a semester in an AP environmental science class right after I got my degree. So that was like part of my network, I guess, but I was still in high school there. You know, I was like trying to figure out where I wanted to be. For the policy specialist stuff, I just like, that was after I got my master's, and I just like said, like, look, I know how to do science. I know how science works. I know that scientists love to claim that their work has policy management implications, but they never actually do the legwork to make it happen. I want to do that now. And that's literally what got me that job. Environmental consulting, I had 2 research experiences in undergrad. One of them was on seagrass, and that's what this gig was supposed to be. The seagrass, the artificial seagrass island I was supposed to be studying sunk into the San Francisco Bay. So they put me on birds. So I was designing experiments to study birds. I also don't like birds, is what I learned. Because they smell and they're a lot bigger than you think they are. But I was designing experiments and I knew how to do that. And so that was, again, leveraging just experiences I had in undergrad. Yeah. And then public educator, I have worked a lot on how to communicate clearly. And I still talk fast. I've never gotten rid of that. But that's just been something that I've practiced for a very, very, very long time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, let's get to one question or 1 or 2 questions online on the chat before we go back to live questions. You see, there's one here, if you're interested, that was interesting. Amelia asked, you say it's important to speak to audiences that share your beliefs. how are we supposed to change minds if we're speaking only to those sort of already in our bubble? And I think maybe there's a little bit of clarification that you can make there.
Yeah. So I was sort of like speeding through the end there. So I didn't really get to say my whole juicy, meaty bit on that. But so what I had up, you saw were like 6 circles, and it was called the 6 Americas of climate change in the US. And it's research done, like social science research done out of Yale Climate Communications. And so it's this idea that basically there are 6 groups of people with varying like beliefs on how urgent climate change is. So some of them don't care at all, and some of them are very alarmed. And depending on which of those spheres you sit in, you're more likely to convince somebody on the spheres adjacent to you of your own beliefs, if that makes sense. So when I'm talking about this bubble, there's obviously your big bubble of like, yes, climate change is a serious issue. And then there's these niche things about where people think they need to prioritize, right? And so, for example, I moved to Oakland in July, and I live near an encampment of unhoused people. And so one of my priorities really shifted just from moving from Berkeley to Oakland and Berkeley. I thought a big issue there was the fact that we had really bad like waste management issues. And now that I've moved here, like my bigger issue is like, oh, how are we going to support this unhoused community in Oakland, which is like really just like spread thin on resources? Like, how are we going to support them through things like flooding and then both like these extreme weather events? And so my example here is to tell you that my bubble shifted, right? My own priorities shifted, but just based on the environment that I was in my own context. So I still think climate change is an important issue, but where I'm putting my focus has changed. And that was me just convincing myself. So that's probably a really bad example in that sense. But what I'm trying to say is that you need to find people who are willing to listen to the bigger picture umbrella issue. And then you find your nuanced take. And that's where you basically have to go and sort of pummel your point in. And you do it delicately and gently and thoughtfully and aggressively all at the same time.
All right, I like that. Well, let's see. Maybe we actually. I'm realizing we are almost out of time. So
sorry.
we'll be able to take. No, that's. There's lots of good questions, and you're doing a great job answering them. Autumn, you have your hand up. Maybe you could ask your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask more about, like, I feel like on a woman's perspective, and you were talking about how you had an issue with like getting authority with like your high school students and how there's been kind of that in the past. And I just wanted to ask, like, how do you build your confidence and your skill set to talk about these issues? Because even I remember having like a conversation with my past professor, how she didn't even feel comfortable talking to her parents about climate change because they didn't believe in it and are very religious, until she got her PhD. So while she was in her master's program, she didn't even feel confident about talking and saying like, hey, that's actually wrong, and these are the reasons why. So I just wanted to ask, like, how do you build up that confidence? And also you were talking about different, different perspectives of people and where they land on believing and not believing, and just how to go about that, because it's definitely a harder topic. And I'm just curious on, did you start speaking with maybe people closer to you and family, or did you just go out into like broad audiences and just kind of cold turkey talk? Like, how did you go about like learning those skill sets?
Yeah, I've learned on the job for sure. Like I've learned like nuts and bolts of science communication. Like one of the first things you learn is like the message box if you're in a formal learning environment. But really based on like what you decide is like the missive that you have to share out in the world, like you will learn and unlearn behaviors. So first, confidence. So I come across as confident, which is like an amazing thing that I didn't know I possess. I'm not confident. Basically, I am in that I know that I'm good at science communication because I look at myself, I'm like, oh yeah, I did all those things. So clearly people care what I have to say and they're willing to bring me back in different places to talk about it. But literally like 15 minutes before this seminar, I like took a deep breather and I just like had to sit and be like, okay, you got this, you know this stuff. And I was going through my slides. I had to sit there and remind myself, yeah, you talk about this stuff. It's okay if you flub a little bit. It's a live thing. It's the end of the day. You spent the day learning a bunch of new things. It's okay if you flub on the things that you know really well. And in terms of talking to like people who are close to you or far of you, or how to be an authority figure. So Sean and I have a colleague at Santa Cruz. Her name is Christy Croker. She's like a very well-respected climate scientist, and her parents still don't believe in climate change. And like, she is like an internationally renowned climate scientist. Like, you go to Australia, people send ocean vacation know her name. Like, she is well known. And so the family connection, it's not always going to happen. I can say from my personal experience that like, I have family who is like, we're very privileged, and they're just waiting for geoengineering to solve climate change. Like, anything I have to offer they don't believe it. And when I talk about how I carry climate grief, they're like, I hope you're seeing a therapist. And I'm like, yes, the solution to climate grief is therapy. So that sometimes it's just not gonna get you there, you know? And so I have to just like accept that I am the authority. And like, I had a moment where I had a distant family member tell me that vegetarian was going to solve climate change, and that I should go watch Seaspiracy, which still like drives me up the wall. That I, like an academic who reads publications for a living and writes them, should go watch a Netflix documentary. And so I was like, I just have to walk away from this conversation and remember, like, no, I'm the one getting a PhD, so they can shove it. And so you have to just like accept that, you know, like you have to actually like talk myself up a lot though. Or I like go to my husband and I'm like, can you remind me why I'm a good leader again or something? You know, like you need cheerleaders too to tell you, even if you can't always remember. So that's really important. And like we have a girl squad of like 4 of us who just like in a circle go and remind each other how awesome we are all the time with random text messages. Highly recommend that. What was the second half of your question, Autumn? I'm sorry.
No, that was pretty much, yes. Talking about the skill set, I guess, to talk to like climate change deniers.
Oh, yes.
And just like, did you cold turkey that, or did you have a little bit of like some background, or did you go into it with like certain things you were going to mention? Yeah.
So if I'm ever talking to somebody who I know is going to be on the fringe of where I'm at, I research the heck out of them or their community, and I figure out what do they really care about? Because fundamentally, everything is a climate issue on some level. And so you prepare to talk about the things that they care about. And you agree that, yeah, you're right, that is really important. I understand why coal is really important to your community. I understand that your family built America, and your family deserves to thrive in this country that you helped build. But it seems like this is not the way. And so that coal is a really, really extreme example because it's very divisive, very sensitive. I did try to go and become somebody who like helps coal workers in the coal industry convert into clean energy jobs. It didn't work out very well. But like there is like, you have to sit there and really do the work, and it's really challenging. Like for me, it was emotional, and actually I dealt with a lot of racism trying to break into some of that. So I didn't end up going that route. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
This conversation is really interesting, and I don't want to cut it short, but I also want to be respectful of your time and the time of our audience. And so I just want to just pause for a second to say thank you so much and give you another big round of applause, because we've really enjoyed speaking with you. And I just want to also just take a moment just to remind everyone who's joining us on YouTube and elsewhere that our seminars are weekly throughout winter quarter. We'll be here next week at 4:30 p.m. on Wednesday as well. And I encourage folks to look out for our advertisements about that seminar and tune in for that as well. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording at this time. So